have joined already. We'll review a bit of what happened in the last couple of weeks. We had a lot of different things happening in the Prisma ecosystem. And then we'll take a look at this week's release, and that is 2.22. And then finally, we'll look at MongoDB, the early access program and the experimental MongoDB connector that we have. We'll take a look at that and see how that might fit into your development workflow if you're a MongoDB user. And for that, Matt will join us, and he will also discuss some other things that you might be interested in. And finally, we'll have a Q&A. So I suggest let's get right into it. And I will also bring Matt onto the stage. So welcome, Matt. It's nice to see you.
Hey, everybody. Good to be here.
It's nice to have you. So we just released this week 2.22, and this was a relatively small release. But besides that, we've had a lot of different releases in the last couple of weeks. So I was hoping that maybe we can go through that with you, and maybe you can share also your perspective. You've been quite active in the design and the planning aspect of a lot of this. So the first thing is that we had this launch, and I will just share my screen. And so we had this launch happen on April 21st. I believe that was 2 weeks ago. And that was the full release of Prisma as an ORM. And that means that Prisma, the full suite of Prisma Client, Prisma Studio, and Prisma Migrate are now ready for production use. And it's been quite a journey to get here. Matt, do you want to share some of your thoughts on how we got here?
Yeah, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Yeah, it's been, we started off with the client kind of making its way through preview and then general availability. Then simultaneously, we were also kind of prototyping and testing and talking with you guys about Migrate, and we were able to push that out. And then, yeah, I guess like we just recently released Prisma Cloud, which is like an online studio. I'm not sure if that's actually, yeah, it is discussed here. Cool. Yeah, and yeah, it's been exciting.
Yeah, so I highly recommend you, if you haven't checked out the blog post, you can check it out. That's at prisma.io/blog, and you'll be able to see a lot more of that. And then to add on to sort of the full release of Prisma as an ORM, we also launched last week our cloud product, and that is the collaborative data browser. So some of you may be familiar with Prisma Studio, and there are a lot of parallels between this cloud product and Prisma Studio, but they should be differentiated because this the collaborative data browser, also known as Prisma's online data browser, actually gives you a lot more additional functionality. It allows you to create different roles, and so this is really useful if you're working in a team and you're collaborating on a project and you want to give access to the data in your database to different participants in your team. And you want to do that, of course, with different sort of like permission levels. And so this is achievable with this online data browser. So if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend you do. And I think on that note, that would be a really a good moment to transition into this week's release. And that is, again, 2.22. So this was a relatively small release, and probably the biggest sort of improvement in this release is that Prisma DB push command is now generally available. So that was up until this version behind a preview flag, and now you no longer need that preview flag when you're using it. So in case some of you are not familiar, Prisma DB push is a command that allows you to quickly create your database schema from your Prisma schema. So as always with Prisma, The Prisma schema is your single source of truth. It is used to generate Prisma client and provide you with all of the type safety and the rich auto completion features. And it's also used to create your database schema. And so that's how we achieve this type safety and a lot of the nice things about Prisma. So we also have Prisma Migrate. And I think one of the questions that comes up very often is, when should you use Prisma DB push and when should you use Prisma Migrate? And I think, first of all, it's important to understand how both of these work and what is sort of the differences between them in order to know when to choose which one. But the sort of the very short version of that is that if you're cloning a project, right, a Prisma project that already has migrations, of course, you can use Prisma Migrate, the dev command, in order to get up and running in your local development environment. And so if you run npx Prisma Migrate dev, it'll actually execute all of the migrations for you. However, if you've already done that, or if you're just starting out on a new project and you've started modeling sort of your schema using the Prisma schema, and you want to already quickly get your database schema in sync with that, then that is when Prisma DB push is useful. And so the one situation where it's not relevant is when you are deploying your migrations to production. You would never use Prisma DB push for that. You risk data loss and so on. And so, yeah, that's sort of how that's a useful way to think about it. Prisma DB push gives you a quick way to create your database schema. You can do that if you're just prototyping, even if you've already created your database schema and you're just quickly experimenting with some new fields, new relations, and so on. So that's that. But perhaps Matt can elaborate on that further.
No, I think you did a pretty good job. It's like I kind of think of DB push as pushing up to GitHub, but I think the caveat is that it's not really made for production. Migrations are more the tool you use for production.
Right. Oh, okay. So I see all of you joining. Thank you. Feel free to drop a hello message to us in the chat. We do see this, and it does brighten our mood. Okay, let's move on with the release note. So we've also had a small sort of deprecation for the provider field in the Prisma schema. So the provider field is part of your data source block, and maybe I can quickly get a something to show how that looks like. I'm just checking out now the.
I think you should make your font a bit bigger, actually.
Yeah, I will do that.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, cool. So here we have a Prisma schema, and here we have a provider. So in the data source block, we have this provider, and previously you could define that as an array. And the reason that you could define that as an array is because there were many situations where users wanted to use SQLite during local development and a different database in production. And the reason for that is because SQLite is very easy to set up. You don't need to start a whole database server on your local machine. However, we, and please correct me, Matt, if I don't get this fully correct, but as I understand it, what happened was that there were actually discrepancies in terms of how SQLite works compared to, say, MySQL or Postgres. And so if you had two providers in your data source block, in your provider, then you would potentially encounter some bugs relating to something that works in Postgres but doesn't work in SQLite. And so the principle that we generally follow when it comes to sort of local development and working in multiple environments, whether that's local development, staging, or production, is that you want to keep these different environments as close to each other as possible and prevent sort of any errors due to discrepancies between these different databases. And so now we only support a single value. So that was.
I can add, I guess, a bit to that, Daniel.
Sure.
Yeah, I think this is all. This like got very popular, the SQLite to Postgres from Rails. Like that was the Rails default workflow for a very long time. If you just Google like SQLite Rails problems, like you're going to see a whole bunch of them. And there are like significant differences between SQLite and Postgres, for example. And so we just didn't like want to open ourselves up to like these days with Docker and like Homebrew and these other package managers, it's really easy to get a local database, Postgres database or MySQL database running on your machine. And so we just, the point, like being like all the edge cases that come up from switching between MySQLite and Postgres in production just didn't feel like it was worth the hassle nowadays. So.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, that was an interesting insight. Now, we've also, some of you may know, we already have a Go, Prisma Client Go, a Prisma Client in Go, and we've recently added more support when it comes to querying. And so, do you want to speak to that, Matt?
Yeah, this is just like a small improvement, but an improvement nonetheless. Yeah, the Go client just used to support or. It was a bit of an oversight, and we just added and support this sprint. Yeah, it's a small change, but meaningful for some of our users.
Yeah, so if you are using the Go client for Prisma, please feel free. This is still sort of in a preview state right now. We urge you, you know, if you have feedback, this really helps us improve the product. And so any feedback that you have about how it works and how it could be improved would really, really help us. And so in this release, we also had a lot of different small fixes and improvements, and I won't go through all of them, but is there anything that you think is worth speaking to, Matt?
Most of the stuff wasn't really user-facing. It was a bunch of like internal plumbing improvements along the ways. Yeah, there's not too. One thing that might be worth calling out is Next.js and Webpack 5. We got quite a few reports from you guys that it wasn't working properly, and from my understanding, Next.js, the next version of Next.js, I think it's 8 or maybe not. I don't know, one of those versions. There's a way to use Webpack 5 now. It's not the default yet, but presumably it will become the default. There's a way to turn it on in Next, and so people are trying that, and Prisma didn't work with that, and we fixed that as far as I can tell. If you do run into other issues, please open them, but now you should be able to use the latest Webpack with the latest Next.js with Prisma.
Yeah, thank you for that, Matt. It's quite interesting in the JavaScript and Node.js ecosystem, the amount of bundlers. It seems to me sometimes that whenever I open Twitter, there's like a really popular tweet about a new bundler that is allegedly faster. It's quite fascinating to keep track of that. But Webpack, I think, has evolved quite nicely and has provided a lot of flexibility in terms of how you bundle your apps. And you know, you see some of the advanced use cases of that happening in Next.js. I think that's also one of the great things about Next.js. It's the fact that to get started with Next.js, you don't have to spend hours configuring and tweaking your Webpack file. So yeah, anyways, that's that. A lot of under the hood fixes in Prisma. And on that note, I think it would be a good time to speak about MongoDB, one of our most requested features. So we just released, we just started the early access program. I think it was 2 weeks ago. And we've already been gathering a lot of feedback from you about this Mongo. So we wanted to, first of all, preface this by saying that the MongoDB adapter connector for Prisma is still in early access. We're working hard at it to make it fully functional and to reach the kind of like feature parity that you expect when working with something like Postgres. However, that will take time. And so during this period, it's quite vital for us to get your feedback and to hear how you're doing. But it will also require your patience because there's quite a lot of well, MongoDB is a fundamentally different database when compared to relational databases, and so there's a lot of challenges along the way to make sure that you can make full use of the functionality provided by MongoDB and still benefit from all of the things that Prisma has to offer. And so on that note, I'd love to sort of give a short presentation, Matt. Matt, feel free to jump in at any moment. Do you want to also preface this with anything before I get into the demo?
Yeah, that would be great. So I want to underscore what Daniel said. It is experimental still. You should not put it in production. It is for play right now. And we are working on making it production ready, but we have very serious production related issues that you may lose your data, like et cetera. So we are working on addressing these, but do not put this in production. I know you won't listen to me, but nonetheless, please just give it a shot. Like we're iterating on it every week, and it's exciting. It's coming together quickly and nicely, but there's still some problems, and we want you to try it and give us feedback, but don't put it in production, please.
Great. So on that note, I will just go ahead and present a bit of the conceptual framework for thinking about how Prisma fits into MongoDB. And I'll start that by talking about some practices that improve your productivity, practices and tools. And so I think there's three sort of approaches that have become very mainstream in the world of application development. And these are testing, automation, and type safety. These are sort of three things that allow, if you look at testing allows you to verify the correct behavior of the software that you're building. And that may include unit tests, end-to-end tests, and even load tests. Automation, that reduces toil by automating the repetitive aspects of your development lifecycle. So for example, you have a build process where you might build or run, the TypeScript compiler, you might run tests, you might even release from that build pipeline to NPM or whatever package manager you're using. And of course, you may even deploy your application in your automation pipeline, so your CI/CD pipeline, that is. And then finally, I think this one is sort of gaining more traction inside the node.js ecosystem, and that is type safety. And that is thanks to TypeScript. And type safety is a broad term that is often used in the context of statically typed languages like TypeScript and Go. But the idea with type safety is that by defining types in your application code, you can detect these type errors and type mismatches earlier than runtime by running essentially the compiler. And I think these three practices, they have a common thread, and that is they provide you with a shorter feedback loop, which sort of leads me to the next point. So shorter feedback loops are not a new idea in software development. It's in fact one of the cornerstones of agile development and applies to many stages of your application development lifecycle. So the feedback loop could be defined as the process in which an action's effect circles back to the action and then used as feedback. So for example, you push a commit, which triggers your CI pipeline, which either passes or not. And if it doesn't pass, you get that useful feedback about perhaps a test that failed, or perhaps the TypeScript compiler failed due to a type error in your application. And so feedback loops are everywhere in software development. And as a developer, as a team, or even as a company, you're essentially engaging in this iterative process of creation through experimentation. And throughout this iterative process, feedback is essential because that's how you verify your assumptions. Now, feedback loops vary in terms of the amount of time from the action to the feedback. So running the TypeScript compiler locally will give you very quick feedback when compared to pushing something and then running automated tests, especially something like end-to-end tests, which might take a longer amount of time. So I want to sort of take this idea of feedback loop and see how it applies to type safety. And so a type error occurs when a value in an operation is of a different type from what the code expects. And, you know, when comparing sort of JavaScript and TypeScript, well, JavaScript is loosely typed and doesn't support this idea of type safety. So when you define the following function, there's a bunch of different ways that it can fail. You can call it without passing an object, and then you'll get this sort of error. And the thing is, you will only get that error once you actually run this bit of code. So what if you pass a partial object? Well, you won't even get a type error. JavaScript will just run it, and you will get, if you don't pass the last name, you will get sort of this weird string that has undefined. And this is because of a feature in JavaScript known as implicit type coercion. And again, the problem with this approach in JavaScript is that you only detect these type errors at runtime. And so in late 2012, TypeScript came along and suddenly offered you as a developer working with JavaScript the following proposition. You add types to your JavaScript and we'll make your life easier by catching a lot of errors for you. And so with TypeScript, you'll have to carry an umbrella. You know, it's a bit of an extra effort to schlep the umbrella with you, but when it rains, TypeScript will catch the type errors and keep you dry. And so you can eliminate a whole class of errors, and that is type errors. I think many of you who are already using TypeScript are familiar with this idea, and it's not something new. And so, you know, in TypeScript, you can take that function, the getFullName function that I just showed you before, and you can sort of annotate it with the different types. So here I'm annotating the user parameter as an object that contains two fields, both of the type string, and then I also annotate the function return value as a string. And so then suddenly with TypeScript, we get a whole bunch of errors that we get immediately in our IDE as we're writing the code. And so this is just the kind of, as an example, the kind of error that you get in VS Code as you're typing it. So you don't even need to run the code. And so the point I'm trying to make is that the feedback loop, the duration of the feedback loop is much, much shorter with TypeScript. You get that sort of immediate feedback. And so this brings us to the three-tier architecture, probably the most common way to look at modern web applications. You have three tiers essentially, and those are the presentation tier, application tier. Sometimes the application tier is also called the logic tier, and then the data tier. Now the presentation includes a web client. It might even include native mobile apps. The application tier is really responsible for the business logic and the coordination between user requests and the database. And finally, the data tier. This is the source of truth for your data and where your data is stored. So this begs sort of, when looking at this three-tier architecture, functions, it applies to a traditional long-running process that, you know, you might have multiple instances of. And sort of the immediate question that comes to mind when we talk about type safety in this three-tier architecture is, how can we introduce type safety to the layer between the application tier and the data tier? And this is what we want to do. And this is sort of like a good way to enter the whole topic of MongoDB and type safety. So here we have the MongoDB driver for node.js, and we have this getUser function, which fetches a single user document from the user collection. A collection in MongoDB corresponds to a table in relational databases like MySQL and Postgres. And the problem with this function is it's written in TypeScript, but it isn't type safe. So I'm using the projection field, which basically is like the select parameter in Prisma client. That means that I want to just get back the first name and the last name. And so if we wanted to make this type safe, what essentially we'd want to do is to guarantee that this function will return us an object containing first name and last name. But this is quite a challenge with MongoDB because MongoDB supports a flexible schema. And so this is directly from the MongoDB documentation. MongoDB's collections by default do not require documents to have the same schema. What does this mean in practice? Well, it means that multiple documents, different documents in the same collection, for example, a user collection, they do not have to have the same set of fields. So some of them might have first name, some of them might have last name, some of them may have even other fields. And also the data type for a field can differ across documents. So you might have one document that has a last name that is of type string, and then you might have, perhaps mistakenly, another document with the last name as an integer or a number, so to say. And being too flexible can really be a challenge. So there's a sort of set of trade-offs here that are at play. And if there is no consensus on what your data model should look like, and every document in a collection contains vastly different fields, the application layer will have to deal with all of that complexity. Essentially, you will have to implement in your application logic all of the different cases to account for the different potential structures of a document in a given collection. So this sort of brings us to this idea: what if we add a schema? What if we introduce a schema to ensure more consistency across documents in a single collection? And this is not a new idea. There are actually a number of solutions that have addressed these challenge of a flexible schema in MongoDB. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is quite an interesting sort of set of solutions that is very common in sort of the node.js ecosystem when working with MongoDB. And so the first approach is what they call MongoDB schema validation, and that makes it possible for you to define a JSON schema and enforce that against your MongoDB database, essentially. So you define that on your MongoDB database, and then this schema then is enforced every time you write to that collection. So that is the first approach, and it uses JSON schema, which is standardized, and it is enforced during updates and insertions. And then second, we have Mongoose, and Mongoose is a Node.js object data modeling library that allows you to enforce that schema on the application layer. So unlike MongoDB's schema validation feature, this happens within your application during runtime. One moment, just getting an error here. Yeah, so that was Mongoose. And Prisma, many of you are probably familiar with Prisma. Prisma uses the Prisma schema to enforce this schema, but in addition to that, it also provides you with type-safe database access. So how do some of these compare? So MongoDB schema validation is enforced on the database layer, and both Mongoose and Prisma enforce this on the application layer. So how does Mongoose compare to Prisma? Well, Mongoose enforces the schema during runtime, whereas Prisma is unique is that in that it not only enforces that schema, but it provides you type-safe access. And so you actually get these generated types that give you this feedback while you're writing the code. You don't actually have to run it. This is what a basic sort of Prisma schema would look like in the context of MongoDB. It's very similar to the same format that you've used if you've used Prisma with other databases like Postgres and MySQL, with a tiny difference here that you actually denote, for example, that the ID field is of type object ID that is unique to the database. And so here we have this ID field, the last name is optional, and the email has a unique index. Now let's take a look at how relations work, because relations are quite a big topic in MongoDB. They don't quite work the same way as relational databases, and that is because you have two ways to define relations in MongoDB. But and the two ways to define relations in MongoDB are, the first is what they call embedded documents. And then the second approach is using references. And there's a bunch of different trade-offs that I won't go into now. What's important to know here is that we're using references in this schema. And so here we define essentially a relation between the model user and the model post, and then a single user can have multiple posts. And we have this reference. A reference is like a foreign key in the world of Mongo. And we use this user ID in the post model, which has, again, the same type, db.objectID, in order to be related to a user. Now, many of you are probably familiar, so I won't talk about this so much. And I think this is a good note to actually just give this a quick test run. And so I've prepared here a little project. I believe it's not this one, it's this one. And again, I have the same schema that I just showed you. And I also, in my end file, I'm connecting to a local Mongo database. And so the first thing that I might want to do is, I've defined this. I probably want to run npx prisma generate to make sure that the client is generated and it's synced with the Prisma schema. And so that's been generated for us. So we can get rolling. And this is the first example. So here I'm creating a user, and I'll maybe open up the Prisma schema by the side. So as you can see, if I'm going to add here a field that isn't in the schema, like non-hello, I already get an error, and this is an error because it's actually not defined as a type. So generally, Mongo would just take this information, and if this was using the MongoDB client, then I would be able to push that, no problem. But again, we're trying to introduce the schema as a guardrail that then prevents you from a lot of errors down the road. And so this is why we get this error. And again, here, when I go dot, you can see that I have all of the different properties that are available as per the schema. And so I can already go ahead and run this script, and I will do that. TS node, create user. And as expected, we get this user that we created, and of course we have the object ID included in it too. We can also find users using this find unique, and again, I expect to get the same object as before. Now, what if I wanted to update that user? Well, I could use the Prisma user update, and then update it based on the email and update the last name to Peters. And if I do that, I again expect the same ID, however, with a different last name. I think I have another example here of course, deleting a user. And that is that. And so our user will be deleted. And I also have the MongoDB compass here. And I will reload that. And as you can see, we don't have that user anymore. And
one thing maybe worth calling out, Daniel, is that this is the same Prisma API that you're used to if you're used to working with Postgres or MySQL. So it's really nothing new here from a application developer standpoint. The schema is a bit different in a few places, but it's the same API that you know and love.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was, for me, sort of coming back into MongoDB after about 4 or 5 years that I haven't touched it. And of course, in the last 2 years, I've worked quite extensively with Prisma. It just felt so natural. I could just take all of what I knew from Mongo, all of what I knew from Prisma, and just get rolling. Yeah, this is really nothing new. This is the same API that you're familiar with, and the same kind of like type safety features. Of course, relations work slightly differently, but again, the API itself is the same. And as you can see, also the return type that we get is also the same. In fact, even here, we have the same sort of type safety that we have in all of the other queries. So I think that's a good moment to sort of wrap this demo up. And on that note, Matt, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you did a great job. Do you want to share maybe the getting started document, or how do people try this on their own if they want to?
Yes, so great. So we have a type form that we'd like you to sign up on. I'll share the link in the chat in a moment. But after I share the link, you can just sign up at the type form, and you'll basically get within a couple of minutes the email with all of the details on how to get started with MongoDB. So I'll just look for that. And I think that's probably a good moment to open up a Q&A. So if you have any questions, we're ready to take them. I think I saw some questions. Just sure said the latest Next.js is 10. Yes, but I believe kind of thought that Prisma folks would know that. Yes, indeed it's 10, but was it 10 that introduced Webpack 5, or was it one of the minor versions there?
I learned a lesson today. I'm not sure. I also responded to him that
Okay.
Other Prisma folks probably know. I'm a bit behind.
Yeah. I mean, with the pace of everything changing, it's hard to keep up with everything. But
yep.
Nevertheless, we're here, so we're ready to take some questions if you have any. And I'm just looking for the Typeform link for MongoDB. Okay. Let's see. Interesting. We don't have a lot of questions from the audience. I also want to note that there isn't such a thing as stupid or dumb questions. Please feel free to ask questions of any level, and we'll do our best to answer. Now, okay. Let's see. All right. And I will drop the link to the MongoDB. All right, I dropped the link for the sign up form for the MongoDB Early Access program. And if there aren't any questions, I think this is a good moment to wrap up. Quick reminder that we have, following this live stream, in 20 minutes, we are going to host the Prisma meetup, and we have a bunch of really exciting speakers today. We have a developer advocate who's joining us from Redis, I believe. His name is Guy Royce, who will give us an introduction, a D&D themed introduction to graph databases. That will also be followed by a talk by Giulietta Curti, who recently joined the Prisma team, and she will talk about Prisma's developer experience. And then finally, we have two speakers who are joining us from Cockroach Labs, and they're going to give the talk. Their names is Andy Woods and Adam Storm, and they're going to give a talk about the future is multi-region, building a world-class multi-region application in 4 easy steps. So in case you're not familiar, Cockroach is a database that aims to be compatible with Postgres, at least wire compatible. However, it's the main sort of idea with Cockroach is that it's supposed to be scalable, horizontally scalable, and it is heavily inspired by the Google Spanner paper, in case some of you have heard of that. So they'll be joining us. Oh, yeah, I see we have a question, coding and caffeine. Do we still have to run npx Prisma migrate, then the Prisma generate preview? First
I was trying to respond to this one. Coding and caffeine, are you talking about Mongo, or are you talking about it in general? If you're talking about Mongo, We don't support data migrations yet. Mongo's a bit different than SQL in that there's not really an enforced schema. It's an optional schema. And so we don't have that implemented yet. In general, though, yes, you do need to run migrate and then Prisma generate for the SQL databases.
Yeah, and I believe that the Prisma migrate dev command, if you run it not with Mongo but with Postgres or MySQL, it'll automatically run Prisma generate for you
Yeah, I think
after
that's right.
applying the migration. So yeah, on that note, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. And if you're interested, join us for the follow-up live stream, the Prisma meetup. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always great to have you and share your insights. Is there anything else that you would like to share before we wrap up today?
No, I think this was great, Daniel. Thanks for putting this together. And yeah, if you have a chance, please sign up for the type form, and you'll get invited to a private Slack with us in there. And yeah, give Mongo a shot. We'd really appreciate it.
Great. So on that note, hope to see you here in 2 weeks at the next What's New in Prisma.